The crystal chandeliers of the Halbrook Grand Hotel didn't just light up the ballroom. They seemed to expose every wrinkle in my silk dress, every year I had carried on my back, and every doubt I had tried to suppress. At 68, I had expected this night, my 45th wedding anniversary, to be a quiet celebration of endurance. Instead, it felt like a high-stakes theater production where I was the only one who hadn't memorized the script. "Mother, you look radiant," Vanessa whispered, leaning in to kiss my cheek. Her breath smelled faintly of expensive mint and something sharp, like ozone before a storm. Vanessa was the daughter-in-law everyone dreamed of. She was gentle, as my son Daniel often reminded me. She spoke in hushed melodic tones, wore soft pastels that complemented her porcelain skin, and always seemed to be exactly where someone needed a glass of water or a steadying arm. She had insisted on organizing this gala for us. "A sapphire anniversary deserves a sapphire setting," she had told me 3 months ago, her eyes wide and innocent. I looked at her now, standing in the center of the ballroom. She was wearing a dress of pale lavender, her hair pinned back in a modest, elegant bun. She looked like a saint. But as I watched her navigate the crowd of investors and family friends, I noticed the way her eyes never stopped moving. She wasn't just hosting, she was patrolling. "Where is Daniel?" I asked, my voice sounding thin even to my own ears. "He's just finalizing the seating for the main toast, Mother." "Don't worry about a thing," she replied, her hand resting briefly, weightlessly on my forearm. "You just sit here and be the queen of the evening." She guided me to a high-backed velvet chair near the front of the stage. It felt less like a throne and more like a cage. From here, I could see the entire room. There were the Harringtons, our oldest business partners, whispering in the corner. There was Mark, the head of the strategy team, looking uncharacteristically nervous. And there was my son, Daniel, standing by the entrance, his face buried in his phone, his brow furrowed in a way that had become permanent over the last year. The Halbrook Grand was a place of glass and polished stone, a monument to the legacy my late husband, Thomas, and I had built from a single hardware store into a regional empire. Tonight was supposed to be about the 45 years that followed our I do. But as the room filled, the air grew heavy with a tension I couldn't name. I reached for my evening bag, wanting to find my spectacles to read the program Vanessa had printed. My fingers brushed against a thick envelope I had tucked inside earlier. A letter from our family lawyer that I hadn't yet found the courage to open in private. Something about the way Vanessa had been helping with the estate transition lately had left a bitter taste in my mouth. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention." Vanessa's voice rang out, amplified by the house speakers. She was standing at the podium now, bathed in a soft blue spotlight. The room fell silent. I saw Daniel click his phone shut and move toward the side of the stage. He didn't look at me. He looked at Vanessa. 45 years, Vanessa began, her voice trembling slightly with what everyone assumed was emotion. 45 years of building, of dreaming, and of leading. Today we celebrate Margaret and the memory of Thomas. But as Margaret herself told me recently, a legacy isn't just about looking back. It's about knowing when to hand over the torch to those who will carry it into the next generation. A cold prickle started at the base of my neck. I had never said those words. Not to her. Not to anyone. I looked down at the program resting on the small table beside my chair. It was a beautiful piece of cardstock, embossed with sapphire foil. I flipped it open, searching for the Matriarch's reflection, the 5-minute slot Vanessa had promised me for my speech. My breath hitched. The schedule didn't list me. Where my name should have been in bold, elegant script were the words, "The Future of the Legacy, a special announcement by Vanessa and Daniel." Beside it, my name appeared only once at the very bottom, under a section titled, "In Appreciation of Service Emeritus Status." Emeritus. A polite word for retired. A polite word for finished. I looked up, my eyes searching for Daniel's. He was staring at the floor, his jaw tight. He knew. My own son, the boy I had stayed up with through every fever and coached through every business failure, was standing there while his wife prepared to eulogize my career, while I was still breathing. Vanessa continued, her smile widening just a fraction. A tiny predatory shift that only someone who had spent decades reading people would notice. In honor of this Sapphire milestone, we aren't just celebrating a marriage. We are celebrating a new beginning. A transition that ensures the Harrington name remains synonymous with progress, under a new, unified leadership. She turned her gaze toward me, her eyes shimmering with a terrifying blank kindness. Mother, we know how tired you've been. We know how much you've sacrificed. And tonight, we want to give you the greatest gift of all. The freedom to finally let go. The applause started, light at first, then swelling as the guests, fueled by champagne and Vanessa's carefully crafted narrative, rose to their feet. They thought they were witnessing a beautiful, voluntary passing of the guard. They thought I was being honored. I felt the weight of the envelope in my bag. I realized then that the insurance papers Vanessa had brought to my bedside when I had the flu last month weren't for the house. They were the keys to the kingdom, and I had handed them over because I had trusted the gentle girl who brought me tea. As the spotlight shifted, momentarily blinding me, I realized the shadow of the Sapphire anniversary wasn't cast by the past. It was cast by the woman standing at the podium, who was currently beckoning me up to the stage with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I stood up, my knees shaking, but my mind suddenly, violently clear. Vanessa thought she had written the ending to my story. She thought the old lioness was ready for the den. But as I stepped toward the microphone, I felt the cold, hard edge of the lawyer's envelope against my palm. Vanessa had spent months planning this night, but she had made one fatal mistake. She assumed that because I was old, I had forgotten how to fight. Thank you, Vanessa, I said, my voice cracking the silence of the room. I didn't take her hand. I took the microphone. The hook was set. The room went still. And for the first time that night, the gentle mask on Vanessa's face slipped, just enough to show the panic beneath the porcelain. The microphone felt unnervingly cold in my hand, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the ballroom. I stood there, bathed in the same blue spotlight that had just celebrated my retirement, and felt the collective breath of 500 people hitch. Vanessa's hand was still hovering in the air, a graceful gesture frozen in time, her smile now looking like a ceramic mask that had begun to hairline fracture. Thank you, Vanessa, for such a moving tribute, I said, my voice projecting with a steady resonance I hadn't felt in years. I didn't look at her. I looked at the crowd. I looked at the Harringtons who were leaning forward in their seats, and then finally, I looked at my son. Daniel was pale. His eyes were darting between me and the side of the stage, where two men in security uniforms were standing. I realized then that they weren't hotel security. They were private contractors, likely hired by Vanessa to escort me out if I made a scene. But the scene had already begun. My daughter-in-law is right about one thing, I continued, pacing the small space of the stage. 45 years is a long time. It's long enough to build a kingdom, and it's certainly long enough to forget how it feels to be hunted in your own home. A murmur rippled through the room. Vanessa stepped closer, her voice a forced, sugary whisper. Mother, you're overwhelmed. The excitement is too much for you. Why don't we sit down and let Daniel finish the toast? She reached for the microphone, her fingers brushing mine. In that second, the gentle Vanessa vanished. Her grip was like a vice, a silent command to shut up and play the part of the senile grandmother. I didn't pull away. I leaned into her, whispering just low enough for the microphone not to catch it. I opened the envelope, Vanessa. I know about the offshore accounts in Daniel's name. I know about the forged signatures on the Sapphire merger. Her eyes widened, the pupils shrinking to pinpricks. For a fleeting second, the predator was visible. Then, with a skill that was almost admirable, she laughed, a light, tinkling sound that echoed through the speakers. Oh, Mother, you and your stories. We really should have checked your medication before the gala, she told the audience, turning her gaze back to the crowd with an expression of heartbreaking pity. Please, everyone, forgive her. It's been a very long day. She signaled to Daniel. My son took a step toward the stage, his face a mask of shame and determination. He was coming to silence me, not out of malice, perhaps, but out of the cowardice that Vanessa had nurtured in him for years. He believed he was protecting the company. He didn't realize he was burying his own mother. Before my son takes me away to rest, I said, raising my voice to cut through the rising chatter, I'd like to offer a toast. Not to the past, but to the truth. I lifted my glass, not of champagne but of the plain water Vanessa had so thoughtfully provided. To the Sapphire anniversary, I declared. A stone known for its hardness and its clarity. They say a sapphire can scratch anything but another sapphire. It is the stone of wisdom, and tonight, I have finally gained mine. I turned to the large screen behind us, which had been cycling through old photos of Thomas and me. Vanessa, you spent so much time preparing this slideshow. But you forgot that I have access to the hotel's media server. I thought our guests might find the new additions to the gallery more interesting than the grainy photos of 1981. Vanessa's head whipped around to the screen. The image of Thomas and me on our wedding day flickered and died. In its place appeared a high-resolution scan of a legal document. The very one I had found in the envelope. It was a transfer of deed for the Halbrook Grand itself, signed by me, but dated on a day I was hospitalized with pneumonia. Below it, a forensic software analysis highlighted the irregularities in the stroke of the pen. Then came the next slide. A series of bank transfers from the Harrington Global Primary Fund into a shell company called VC Innovations. The ballroom went deathly silent. Even the waiters stopped moving. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning and the heavy, ragged breathing of my daughter-in-law. What is this? Michael Harrington stood up, his voice booming. Margaret, what are we looking at? You're looking at the reason for this gala, Michael. I said, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't a celebration. It was a funeral. My daughter-in-law wanted to ensure that by the time the sun rose tomorrow, I would have no legal standing in this company, and Daniel would be the figurehead for her own private empire. Daniel reached the edge of the stage, stopping dead as he stared at the screen. Vanessa? What? I thought you said those transfers were for the tax restructuring. You said my mother approved them. Vanessa didn't look at him. She was staring at me, her face contorted into something unrecognizable. The gentle girl was gone. In her place was a woman who had gambled everything on the assumption that an old woman was too tired to read the fine print. You stupid, bitter old hag, she hissed, the microphone catching every syllable. The gasp from the audience was audible. It was the sound of 1,000 illusions shattering at once. Vanessa realized her mistake instantly. She tried to recoil, to pull the mask back on, but it was too late. The blue light of the Sapphire anniversary reflected in her eyes, making her look cold, calculating, and utterly defeated. I may be old, Vanessa, I said, stepping closer to her until we were inches apart. And I may be tired. But this hag built the floor you're standing on. And tonight I'm taking it back. I looked over at the entrance of the ballroom. The heavy oak doors swung open, and this time it wasn't more investors walking in. It was 3 men in dark suits, their badges gleaming under the chandeliers. Daniel, I said, looking at my son with a mixture of pity and love that hurt more than any betrayal. I hope you have a good lawyer. Because Michael Harrington is about to call for an audit. And the police are here to talk to your wife about more than just a forged signature. Vanessa didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply turned and tried to walk toward the back exit, her lavender silk dress fluttering behind her. But the path was blocked. The Harringtons, the Marks, and the people she had spent all night patrolling, stood as a solid wall of judgment. I lowered the microphone and sat back down in my velvet chair. I felt every one of my 68 years. My hands were shaking now, the adrenaline fading into a deep, bone-weary ache. The shadow of the anniversary had finally passed, but as I watched the police lead Vanessa away, I realized that the light left behind was cold and unforgiving. The kingdom was safe, but the family was a ruin. I looked at the sapphire on my finger, the one Thomas had given me 45 years ago. It was clear. It was hard. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like it finally belonged to me again. The ballroom was a sea of stunned silence as the 2 officers escorted Vanessa toward the side exit. Her lavender dress, once a symbol of her curated elegance, now seemed to drag against the floor like a shroud. Daniel stood at the edge of the stage, his hands trembling as he stared at the screen that still displayed the damning bank transfers. The gentle daughter-in-law was gone, replaced by a ghost of a woman whose ambition had finally outrun her deceit. I sat back in my velvet chair, the weight of the evening finally settling into my bones. The adrenaline that had fueled my speech was receding, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache. Michael Harrington was the first to break the silence. He stepped toward the stage, his expression a mixture of fury and profound respect. "Margaret," he said, his voice echoing in the hushed room, "we will need a full forensic audit of the Harrington global accounts. If what you've shown us is accurate, this goes far beyond family drama. This is corporate sabotage." I nodded slowly. "The files are already in the hands of the authorities, Michael. I didn't just bring the slides, I brought the proof." Daniel finally moved. He climbed the stairs to the stage, his footsteps heavy. He looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. He stopped a few feet away from me, unable to meet my eyes. "Mother, I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know the extent of it. She told me the company was failing. She said you were losing your grip on reality, and that we had to protect the legacy before you threw it all away." "And you believed her, Daniel?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "You believed the woman you'd known for 5 years over the mother who built everything you have?" "She was so convincing," he stammered. "She made me feel like I was the hero of the story, the young visionary saving the empire from a fading matriarch." "Arthur? It's Margaret. I know it's late, but I want to start the paperwork for a full restructuring of the family trust. And Arthur, I want to discuss the legal grounds for disinheriting a direct heir." I hung up the phone and looked out the window at the garden. The moon was high, casting long, silver shadows across the lawn. The battle was won, but the war for the soul of the Harrington legacy had just begun. I wasn't the retired emeritus queen they wanted me to be. I was the founder. And as I sat in the silence of my home, I realized that 45 years wasn't the end of the story. It was just the end of the beginning. The shadow was gone. The sapphire was clear. And tomorrow, I would show them all exactly what happens when you try to betray the woman who built the world you live in. The morning after the Sapphire anniversary gala did not bring the usual peace of the Harrington estate. Instead, the sunlight filtering through the tall windows of the study felt like a harsh interrogator, exposing the dust motes dancing in the air and the deep lines of exhaustion on my face. I had not slept. I had spent the dark hours between 2 a.m. and dawn reviewing every digital footprint Vanessa had left behind, aided by the remote access Mark had provided. By 8 a.m., the gates of the estate were buzzing. I could hear the distant murmur of reporters and the occasional flash of a camera lens through the hedges. They were like vultures, sensing the scent of a dying dynasty. But I wasn't dead yet. A sharp knock at the study door broke my concentration. It was Daniel. He looked worse than I did. His silk tie was gone, his collar was crumpled, and his eyes were bloodshot. He looked like a man who had spent the night watching his world burn, and realizing he was the one who had handed out the matches. "The police released her on bail an hour ago," Daniel said, his voice cracking. "Her father's lawyers moved fast. She's staying at a hotel downtown. She refuses to speak to me, Mother. She just sent a text saying I failed the test. I didn't offer him a seat. I didn't offer him comfort. I simply turned my laptop screen toward him. The test, Daniel, was whether you were a partner or a puppet. You chose the latter. Now look at this." On the screen was a decrypted chat log between Vanessa and a contact labeled Project Phoenix. The messages dated back 18 months. It wasn't just about embezzling money or taking over the company. Vanessa had been planning to sell Harrington Global's core patents, the very soul of our R&D department, to our primary competitor, the Vane Group, for a staggering sum. She was going to hollow us out, Daniel whispered, gripping the edge of the mahogany desk until his knuckles turned white. She wasn't just trying to lead the company. She was going to kill it. She was going to liquidate our life's work and disappear before the collapse, I said coldly. And she was using your signature to authorize the patent transfers. If I hadn't stopped her last night, the new beginning she promised would have ended in a bankruptcy filing by Christmas. The realization seemed to physically crush him. He sank into the chair opposite me, the same chair where his father used to sit and teach him about the importance of the Harrington name. "What do we do?" he asked, sounding like a lost child. "We don't do anything, Daniel," I replied. "Ido. You are going to step down as CEO, effective immediately. I will take over as interim chair until the board can stabilize. You will be placed on administrative leave pending the results of the criminal investigation. If the police find that you were truly unaware of the patent fraud, you might keep your freedom, but you will not keep your office. Mother, please. If I resign now, it looks like a confession, he pleaded. It is a confession, I snapped, standing up. A confession of incompetence. You let a wolf into the nursery because she wore a pastel dress and spoke in a soft voice. You ignored your mother's warnings because you wanted to believe you were smarter than the woman who taught you everything. The phone on the desk rang. It was the internal security line from the front gate. Mrs. Harrington? It's Miller. Mr. Harrington, Michael Harrington, is here. He says it's urgent. And Vanessa is with him. I froze. Daniel jumped to his feet. She's with Michael? Why? Let them in. I commanded, my heart starting to race. 10 minutes later, the study door opened again. Michael Harrington walked in, his face a mask of grim professional duty. Behind him stood Vanessa. She had traded her lavender silk for a sharp, charcoal gray power suit. Her hair was pulled back, so tight it looked painful. The gentle mask wasn't just gone, it had been incinerated. She looked radiant in her malice. Margaret, Michael said, his tone unreadable. Vanessa came to me this morning with an interesting proposition. Before we proceed with any audits or charges, I thought you should hear it. Vanessa stepped forward, her eyes scanning the room with a cold, predatory hunger. She didn't look at Daniel at all. Her focus was entirely on me. You think you won last night because you had a few slides and a dramatic speech, Vanessa said, her voice devoid of its former sweetness. It was flat and metallic. But you've been out of the game too long, Margaret. You still think this is about loyalty and family names. It's not. It's about leverage. She tossed a slim tablet onto the desk. On it was a video, not of business deals or bank transfers, but of a private medical consultation. It was me 3 years ago, in a specialist's office in Switzerland. I was discussing the early signs of a degenerative cognitive condition I had kept hidden from everyone, even Daniel. I found the medical records 6 months ago, Vanessa said, a small, cruel smile playing on her lips. If this video goes to the board, every decision you've made in the last 2 years, including the proof you presented last night, becomes legally questionable. I'll argue that your discovery of my fraud was actually a paranoid delusion caused by your declining health. I'll tie you up in competency hearings until there's nothing left of this company but legal fees. Daniel gasped, looking at me in horror. Mother? Is it true? I didn't answer him. I looked at Michael. And you, Michael? You're siding with her? After what she did? Michael sighed. A sound of profound disappointment. I'm siding with the shareholders, Margaret. If the chairwoman is cognitively impaired and the CEO is a puppet, the stock will hit zero by noon. Vanessa is offering a peaceful transition. She resigns, the charges are dropped, and she gets a quiet payout. In exchange, she destroys the medical records and walks away. No scandal. No collapse. The silence in the room was suffocating. Vanessa leaned over the desk, her face inches from mine. Sign the settlement, Margaret. Retire to your garden. Let the grown-ups handle the wreckage you've left behind. For a moment, I felt the age in my bones. I felt the shadow of the Sapphire anniversary stretching out again, threatening to swallow me whole. My secret was out. My son was broken. My oldest friend was pragmatically betraying me. But then, I remembered the Sapphire. It doesn't break under pressure. It only shines brighter. I looked at the tablet, then at Vanessa. You really think I'd go to Switzerland for a consultation and not have a counter-strategy for the records? Vanessa's smile faltered. I didn't go there for treatment, Vanessa, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. I went there to set a trap. I knew someone would eventually go digging for a weakness. That specialist was an old friend of Thomas's. That video. It's a staged consultation. If you release it, I'll release the medical report from the actual hospital I was at that day, which shows I have the neurological health of a woman 20 years younger. I stood up, towering over her despite my height. You spent 18 months trying to find a crack in my foundation. But I built this house, Vanessa. I know where every stone is laid. I turned to Michael. Michael, If you want to side with a blackmailer over a partner, that is your choice. But the audit is already halfway finished, and the police have more than just bank transfers. They have the Project Phoenix logs. Vanessa's face went pale. The charcoal suit suddenly looked too big for her. The game is over, Vanessa, I said, pointing toward the door. Get out of my house. And Michael? I'll see you at the board meeting. Bring your resignation. As they left, Vanessa stopped at the door. She didn't look gentle. She didn't look powerful. She looked like a shadow that had finally run out of light. I turned to Daniel, who was weeping silently in his chair. The victory was complete, but as the door clicked shut, I realized the cost. The house was finally quiet, but it was the quiet of a tomb. I had saved the company, but in the process, I had realized that the only person left to trust was the woman in the mirror. The silence that followed Vanessa and Michael's departure was heavier than the noise of the gala had ever been. It was a dense, suffocating quiet that filled the corners of the study, pressing against the rows of books and the mahogany desk. I looked at Daniel. He was still sitting in the chair across from me, his head buried in his hands. The confident executive who had stood on that stage hours ago had vanished, leaving behind a man who looked utterly hollow. I didn't think she was capable of that, Daniel whispered into his palms. The video, the medical records. She told me she was worried about your health, Mother. She said you were forgetting things, that you were becoming paranoid. I thought I was protecting you by taking over. I thought I was being the good son. I stood by the window, watching the taillights of Michael Harrington's car disappear through the front gates. A good son asks his mother if she's okay before he tries to take her keys, Daniel. You didn't ask. You just reached for the power. Because she made it so easy, he snapped, finally looking up. His eyes were red, brimming with a mixture of grief and resentment. She made everything seem so logical. Every time you questioned a budget or challenged a strategy, she'd pull me aside and sigh. She'd say, "It's the age, Daniel. She's losing her edge. Don't upset her, just work around her." And I believed her because it was easier than admitting my mother was still sharper than I was. I turned away from the window, the cold glass leaving a faint chill on my fingertips. We have a board meeting in 4 hours. The Harrington Global stock is going to open under immense pressure once the news of the police presence at the gala hits the wires. You cannot be there, Daniel. I have to be there, he protested, standing up. If I'm not there, it looks like I'm in hiding. It looks like I'm guilty. You are guilty, I said, my voice flat and clinical. Not of the fraud, perhaps, but of negligence, of a total failure of character. If you walk into that boardroom today, the directors will tear you apart. They need a sacrifice to appease the investors, and Vanessa isn't there to be the shield anymore. They will turn on you. I walked over to the desk and picked up a heavy silver letter opener, a gift from Thomas on our 10th anniversary. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the weight of the metal. I've already drafted your resignation, I continued. It cites personal family matters and a desire to focus on private ventures. It's the only way you walk away from this without a permanent stain on your professional reputation. If you fight this, Michael Harrington will make sure you never work in this industry again just to save his own skin. Daniel looked at the paper I slid across the desk. It was a death warrant for his career, written in the elegant, precise font of the Harrington legal department. He picked up a pen, his hand shaking so violently that he had to grip the desk to steady himself. With a jagged, hurried motion, he signed his name. Is this what it's come to? He asked, throwing the pen down. 45 years of family, and we're communicating through legal documents? The family died the moment you let Vanessa into the vault, Daniel. Now we are just business partners resolving a dispute. He didn't say another word. He turned and walked out of the study, his footsteps echoing down the hallway until I heard the heavy thud of the front door. I was alone in the house. I sat down and pulled my laptop toward me. There was no time for mourning. I had to coordinate with Mark and the forensic team to ensure the evidence against Vanessa was airtight before her lawyers could file for a dismissal. I spent the next 3 hours in a blur of spreadsheets, encrypted emails, and calls with the DA's office. As the sun began to climb higher in the sky, casting long, golden streaks across the study floor, I found the one thing I hadn't been looking for. It was a hidden folder in the Harrington Global server, masked under a series of innocuous administrative labels. Vanessa had been careful, but she hadn't accounted for the fact that I knew the server architecture better than anyone. I had helped design it 20 years ago. Inside the folder were thousands of recorded audio clips. Vanessa hadn't just been stealing money. She had been recording every conversation in the executive wing for the past 2 years. I clicked on a random file dated 3 months ago. She's getting suspicious. Vanessa's voice came through the speakers crisp and clear. Asterisk, she asked about the Vane Group merger again. I need you to escalate the confusion narrative, Daniel. Tell her she already approved the preliminary terms. Tell her she's repeating herself. Asterisk. Then Daniel's voice. Asterisk, I don't like lying to her, Vanessa. She's my mother. Asterisk. You aren't lying to her, Vanessa replied, her tone dripping with that practiced, gentle honey. Asterisk. You're helping her let go. Do you want her to go out like a legend, or do you want the world to see her crumble? If you do this, we save the legacy. We save her from herself. Asterisk. A long pause. Then, the sound of Daniel sighing. Asterisk, okay. I'll handle the board. Just make sure she's comfortable. Asterisk. I closed the laptop. My hands were cold. Vanessa hadn't just used Daniel. She had seduced him into believing he was an act of mercy. She had twisted his love for me into the very weapon she used to destroy my authority. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. I stood up and walked to the mirror in the corner of the room. I looked at the woman staring back at me. She looked tired, yes. Her hair was silver, and the lines around her eyes were deep. But her gaze was steady. The sapphire on her finger caught the morning light, throwing a sharp blue glint onto the wall. I realized then that the gala, the betrayal, the forged documents, it was all just noise. Vanessa thought she was playing a game of chess, but she forgot that I owned the board. At 8:45 a.m., my car pulled up to the Harrington Global headquarters. The lobby was swarming with security and frantic-looking assistants. When the elevator doors opened on the executive floor, the atmosphere was electric with panic. I walked straight into the boardroom. The directors were all there, huddled in small groups, their faces grim. Michael Harrington was at the head of the table, looking like he was preparing for a funeral. When I entered, the room went silent. Margaret, Michael said, standing up. We weren't sure you were coming. I built this company, Michael, I said, taking my seat at the opposite end of the table. I don't miss meetings. I opened my briefcase and took out a stack of folders, not the ones Vanessa had seen, but the transcripts of the audio recordings I had found an hour ago. Before we discuss the audit or the transition, I said, my voice echoing with a cold, terrifying authority, I think we should discuss the fact that every person in this room has been recorded by Vanessa Cole for the last 24 months. And I have the logs. The blood drained from Michael Harrington's face. He looked at the folders, then at me. The leverage had shifted. The shadow of the anniversary was long, but as the board meeting began, I realized that I wasn't just surviving the betrayal. I was dismantling it piece by piece. Vanessa had wanted a new beginning, and I was going to give her one, starting with a prison cell, and ending with the total erasure of her name from the Harrington story. I looked at the empty chair where Daniel should have been. I felt a pang of grief, but it was distant, like a storm on the horizon. For now, there was work to do. The sapphire was still hard. The light was still clear. And I was still standing. The fallout from the board meeting was swifter and more brutal than even I had anticipated. By the third day following the Sapphire anniversary, the Harrington Global headquarters had become a fortress of legal teams and federal investigators. Michael Harrington had resigned for health reasons. A polite fiction we both agreed upon to prevent a total collapse of investor confidence. Vanessa was under house arrest, her legal team frantically trying to dismantle the mountain of digital evidence I had laid out. I stood in the center of the living room of the estate, surrounded by boxes. Not my boxes, but Daniel's. After the board meeting, I had changed the locks. It was a cold, clinical decision, much like the ones I had made for 45 years in the boardroom. But as I looked at the framed photos of Daniel as a child, the one where he was holding a wooden sailboat Thomas had carved for him, the ice in my chest began to crack. The doorbell rang, a sharp, intrusive sound in the quiet house. It was Daniel. He wasn't the polished executive anymore. He was wearing a tattered hoodie and jeans, his face unshaven, his eyes hollowed out by a week of public disgrace and private realization. "The lawyer said I could come get the rest of my things," he said, his voice barely a shadow. "They're in the foyer," I replied, not moving from my spot by the fireplace. He walked past me, his footsteps heavy on the mahogany floors. Vanessa had wanted to tear up. He stopped at the pile of boxes, his gaze lingering on a small crate filled with his old university trophies. He picked one up, turning it over in his hands, before setting it back down with a sigh that sounded like a collapse. "I saw the news this morning," he said, not looking at me. "Vanessa's father withdrew his bail support. They found the secondary accounts in the Cayman Islands. She's looking at 20 years, mother. She earned every day of it, Daniel." "I know," he whispered. He finally turned to face me. "I keep replaying everything. Every dinner, every conversation. I try to find the moment I should have seen it. But she was so good at making the lies feel like warmth. She made me feel like I was finally the man my father wanted me to be, even while she was helping me bury his legacy." "Your father wanted you to be a man of character, Daniel. Not a man of power. That was the distinction you failed to make." He flinched as if I had struck him. "I lost everything, didn't I? My job, my reputation, my mother." I looked at him, and for a moment, I didn't see the man who had conspired to put me in a home. I saw the toddler who used to cry when he lost his favorite toy. The anger was still there, a dull roar in the back of my mind, but beneath it was a profound, weary sadness. "You haven't lost your mother," I said, my voice softening just a fraction. "But you have lost my trust. And trust, unlike a company, cannot be rebuilt with a merger or a clever marketing campaign. It has to be earned, brick by painful brick." "I don't even know where to start," he admitted, a tear finally escaping and tracking through the stubble on his cheek. "Start by being honest," I said. "Not with me. With yourself. Go to the authorities. Tell them everything you did. Not what Vanessa told you to do, but what you chose to do. Accept the consequences without hiding behind the Harrington name. That is the only way back into this house." He nodded slowly, a look of grim determination finally flickering in his eyes. He picked up the largest box, the one containing the records of his life before Vanessa, and headed for the door. "Mother," he called out from the threshold. "Yes, Daniel. Happy anniversary. I'm sorry it ended like this." The door closed, and the silence returned, heavier than before. I walked over to the desk and picked up the sapphire ring. I hadn't worn it since the night of the gala. It felt heavy, a reminder of the price of endurance. I spent the rest of the afternoon in the garden. The roses were beginning to fade, their petals curling at the edges, but the soil was still rich and dark. I began to weed, the physical labor providing a temporary sanctuary from the legal storms raging outside the gates. As the sun began to set, casting long, amber shadows across the lawn, I saw a figure approaching from the servants' entrance. It was Mark. He was carrying a thick folder and a bottle of wine. "The audit is complete," he said, sitting on the stone bench beside me. "We recovered 80% of the diverted funds. The Vane Group has officially withdrawn their bid for the patents. The company is stable, Margaret." "Stable." I repeated, the word feeling strange in my mouth. "And Vanessa? Her legal team is pushing for a plea deal, but the DA isn't budging. They want to make an example of her. She's become the face of corporate betrayal." We sat in silence for a while, watching the fireflies begin to dance over the hedges. "You did it, Margaret," Mark said quietly. "You saved the empire." "I saved a pile of bricks and a balance sheet, Mark," I replied, looking toward the dark windows of the house. "But the shadow is still there. You can't just audit away a betrayal like this." "No," he agreed. "But you can outlast it. That's what sapphires do, isn't it? They survive the pressure." I looked at my hands, stained with the dirt of the garden. They were the hands of a builder, a fighter, and a survivor. Vanessa had tried to turn my 45th anniversary into a finish line, but she had only succeeded in giving me a new starting point. I took the bottle of wine from Mark and poured 2 glasses. I stood up and looked toward the Halbrook Grand. visible as a glittering needle on the distant skyline. To the future, I said, raising my glass. May it be built on something harder than silk and sweeter than lies. To the future, Mark echoed. The transition was far from over. There would be court dates, board shuffles, and the slow, agonizing process of deciding if Daniel could ever truly be a Harrington again. But as I drank the wine, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The mask was off. The truth was out. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just guarding a legacy. I was living it. The shadow of the Sapphire anniversary had been long, but the dawn was finally coming. And in that light, I knew exactly who I was. I was Margaret Harrington. And I was just getting started. The final gavel of the legal proceedings had fallen 3 weeks ago, but the true silence only arrived today. Vanessa had been sentenced, her name stripped from the company records, as if she were a clerical error that had finally been corrected. Daniel was gone too, not to prison but to a self-imposed exile in a small town upstate, working a manual job to pay off the debts of his own negligence. For the first time in 45 years, the Harrington estate was mine alone. I stood on the terrace of the house, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was a bruised purple, the exact shade of the sapphires that had defined this long, treacherous year. In my hand, I held a single glass of vintage port, Thomas's favorite. The house felt different now. The heavy air of betrayal had cleared, replaced by a crystalline stillness. I had spent the last month systematically undoing Vanessa's touch. The modern, soulless furniture she had moved in was gone, replaced by the sturdy, familiar pieces that held the ghosts of my family's laughter. The mahogany floors remained, unmarred by the gray marble she had coveted. A soft footfall sounded behind me. It was Mark. He didn't say anything at first. He simply stood by the railing, looking out at the sprawling gardens we had fought so hard to keep. "The final transfer is complete, Margaret," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a long journey ended. "The Harrington Foundation is now a separate entity from the corporation. It's protected. No one, not a board member, not a hostile taker, not even a family member, can touch the endowment again." "Thank you, Mark," I said, taking a sip of the wine. It was sharp and sweet. "You've spent more time in courtrooms than in your own office this year." "It was worth it," he replied, turning to look at me. "I saw Daniel yesterday. Before he left." I felt a small, sharp pang in my chest, but it didn't overwhelm me. "And he's working at a shipyard. He looks tired." But for the first time in years, he didn't ask me about the stock price. He asked if the roses in the West Garden were still blooming. I looked down at my hands. They were no longer shaking. Maybe there is hope for him yet. But he needs to learn who he is without a title attached to his name. I couldn't teach him that. Vanessa certainly wouldn't have. Life will have to be his tutor now. We stood in the fading light, two survivors of a war that had been fought with smiles and signatures instead of bullets. The Harrington global empire was smaller now, leaner, but it was honest. I had purged the board of Michael Harrington's allies and replaced them with people who remembered that a company is a pact of trust with the community, not just a machine for generating wealth. "What will you do now?" Mark asked. "The board is stable. The lawsuits are settled. You could actually retire, you know. For real this time." I laughed, a sound that felt surprisingly light. "Retire? And let the world get boring? No, Mark. I've realized that the freedom to let go Vanessa promised me was a trap. True freedom isn't leaving the work behind. It's doing the work because you choose to, not because you have to." I walked back into the study, the heart of my home. The photograph of Thomas and me from our wedding day sat in its rightful place on the desk. I looked at our younger selves, so full of ambition, so unaware of the shadows that would one day gather around our legacy. We had survived 45 years of marriage, and I had survived the year that followed. I sat in the leather chair, feeling the familiar embrace of the worn grain. I opened a new ledger, a physical one, with thick cream paper and a leather binding. Vanessa had loved the digital world because it was easy to hide things in the code. I wanted something that left a mark, something that required the deliberate stroke of a pen. On the first page, I wrote a date, 1 year after the Sapphire anniversary. Beneath it, I began to draft the charter for a new mentorship program. One for young women in business, designed to teach them not just how to climb the ladder, but how to spot the snakes hidden in the rungs. It would be my true legacy. Not a building, not a stock ticker, but a shield for those who came after me. The shadow of the anniversary had been long, but it had also been a teacher. It had shown me that power is nothing without perception, and that the greatest danger isn't the person who hates you, but the one who pretends to love you for what you own. As the moon rose, casting a silver glow over the study, I leaned back and closed my eyes. I could almost hear Thomas's voice in the rustle of the curtains, a quiet murmur of approval. I had protected the house. I had saved the name. And in the process, I had reclaimed the woman I was before the world tried to tell me I was finished. I wasn't an emeritus anything. I was Margaret Harrington, the woman who turned a betrayal into a blueprint. I picked up my pen again. There was so much more to write. The sapphire was no longer just a stone of memory. It was a compass pointing toward a future I had earned with every gray hair and every hard-won truth. The story didn't end with a toast. It didn't end with a conviction. It ended with a woman in a quiet room, finally at peace with the strength of her own heart. The sapphire was clear, the foundation was deep, and for the first time in 46 years, I knew exactly where I belonged.